Io sono Bruno Riccio, membro del direttivo della SIA e ho onere di presentare la seconda keynote lecture di questo interessantissimo convegno. Anzi, voglio ringraziare molto Martina Gioffre, Selenia Marabello, Turci per questo lavoro che sono riusciti a fare in questi 2 giorni. Ho potuto navigare tra un panel e l'altro e sono stato veramente impressionato della qualità di molti interventi. Continuerò in inglese perché ci tenerei a far sapere al nostro ospite come lo introduciamo. It is a great pleasure to introduce Thomas Hylland Eriksen, whom many of us know as former president of EASA, European Association of Social Anthropologists, and who is also professor of social anthropology at the University of Oslo. Norway is a context where the public engagement of social anthropology displays a long-term legacy. Professor Eriksen is a protagonist of this process. This is why we have tried various times to get him here with us, and I'm very glad that we have managed it at the end before I leave the executive board of our association. His research has dealt with social and cultural dimensions of globalization, ranging from multiculturalism to creolization and conviviality, ethnicity, nationalism, and identity politics, to the history of our discipline and its impact on the public space, and to accelerated change and environmental crisis. It is a real challenge to conflate these enormous scientific production. Therefore, as Professor Piasere did introducing the first lecture of our conference yesterday, I will take a personal shortcut. During the 90s, his bestseller, Ethnicity and Nationalism, was for me, as many other colleagues, not only from anthropology, but also from social sciences in a broader sense of the word, a real must. Later, his handbook, Small Places and Large Issues, was used at Sussex University when I was teaching, meanwhile completing my DPhil, and Thomas was visiting professor. I still remember his stimulating insights and feedbacks at the workshops of the doctoral program, always balanced between a healthy skeptical view of our ability to foresee the future. On the one hand, I remember the anecdote you shared with us about political scientist Leppard declaring Lebanon as the best example of a consociational model of democracy just before the war started. And on the other hand, a persistent trust on the potential relevance of the anthropological approach to many crucial problems for contemporary global society. Think about his blog, Engaging with the World. Indeed, the book Globalization provided us with an analytical portrait that Herzfeld would have called a militant middle ground position in the previously polarized anthropological debate over global transformations. Whereas his book Engaging Anthropology has influenced also many of us, also here in Italy. Think about Lenzi Grillini e Zanotelli book, collected edition Subire la cooperazione, is just an instance. More recently, 2 of his books, Tyranny of the Moment, very relevant for the theme that Martina Gioffre chose for this year's conference, and Overheating, first of many books stemming from his ERC project, have been translated into Italian, namely Tempo tiranno, velocità e lentezza nell'era informatica, and the very known Fuori controllo, un'antropologia del cambiamento accelerato. However, his latest book is Boomtown, Runaway Globalization on the Queensland Coast. Today, he will talk to us about synchronization and de-synchronization at the time of smartphone. I'm very excited because I know Thomas to be a fascinating lecturer. And I thank Geoffrey, Marabelle, and Tucci to have allowed me to present him. Just enjoy. Thomas.
Okay, thank you. Right. Well, thank you so much, Bruno. It's a real pleasure. I wish we could have met sort of physically and had a good meal afterwards, but that's how it is. So next year we'll manage. And thank you so much for your very generous introduction. And it's been great to follow your work as well, since we met in Sussex more than 20 years ago. So the interest is mutual. Now, I'm going to do this afternoon, evening, is to talk about really one of the subject areas that we should have studied in our overheating project, but didn't. I mean, overheating was about the anthropology of accelerated change. And acceleration can be found in many domains. I mean, we looked at waste, for example. We had a special issue on waste. We had a book about identity. I've also written a book which was published as an open access book in Italian, together with Martina Vicentin, who's actually here, who's virtually here, on identity and overheating. But we had another one in English, an edited volume. We looked at mining, and we looked at climate and several other aspects of and the rise of the populist, neo-nationalist right as an overheating effect. But one thing that was perhaps almost too obvious, and we therefore didn't have a separate sub-project on it, was information technology, ICT, the smartphone, the internet, the way in which this has accelerated so many processes in the world and tied us more tightly together. So I'm trying to make amends now. So I have a small post-overheating project on the smartphone. And I have published a little bit, and there will be more to come. Quite clearly, the smartphone is now everywhere. You know, Clifford Geertz said in 1963 about nationalism that, you know, if you're going to do anthropology today in the South, or in the developing world, as he said at the time in 1963, it's inevitable that you look at nationalism. And by nationalism, he meant the independence movements of the colonies. And for some, the post-independence, you know, efforts at nation building. Because he said that almost no matter where you go, you will encounter these sort of very modern and very contemporary and very state-oriented forms of thinking and ideology. So don't delude yourself into thinking that you're going to a very remote place where everything is very different. Yes, lots of things are different, but some things are not. And nationalism, he identified as one thing that one really couldn't avoid looking at. And the same thing could today be said about the smartphone. No matter where you go, almost no matter where you go, the worlds in which you immerse yourself as a field-working anthropologist will be affected by and sometimes shaped by smartphones. I mean, I know that several of you are engaged with research on refugees on the Mediterranean path, as it were, from North Africa and the Levant to Europe. You know, without the smartphone, the situation for the refugees would have been extremely different. And perhaps I'll make some comments about that later on. You can go to Borneo and you'll discover that, you know, people there are actually, they're on Facebook. And they're using social media, and they're using various apps in order to network with people and to get information. In the late 1960s, Frederick Barth did fieldwork in Hylland, New Guinea, among the Bactaman, like many others. And the Bactaman at the time, they were a group of about 185 individuals by the time he arrived. When he left, there were just 183, okay, because 2 had died. They had, at the time, in the late 1960s, they had never touched a coin. They had never seen a newspaper. They'd never listened to a radio program. They had never put on a Milan t-shirt, okay? They had very little contact and hardly any knowledge about the outside world. They spoke only the Bactaman language, and no outsider, except one, spoke Bactaman. And this one person who spoke Bactaman turned out to be he became Frederick Barth, field assistant, because he could also speak Pidgin English. Now, if we look at the Bactaman today, or the people who are living in this particular part of New Guinea, you'll quickly discover that some of them have gone to college, many of them have worked in the mines nearby, and a few of them would be active on the social media. So this just illustrates, the speed with which the world has changed and how ubiquitous the smartphone is. A few months ago, I went out and had a glass of wine with an old friend of mine, who's a researcher in a very different field. So he asked me, so Thomas, what are you doing now? And I said, well, I'm trying to, to look into the smartphone and some of its implications for contemporary life in various parts of the world, comparatively. And he said, well, that's funny, because that's what I do as well. And I said, what? Because I knew that he was looking at insurgencies in Hylland, in upper Myanmar, okay? He's a peace and conflict researcher. And he turned out that the guerrillas and the state and the smugglers and those small stateless peoples about whom James Scott wrote in his book, The Art of Not Being Governed, they use a smartphone all the time to coordinate the movements, to get information from the outside, and just to relax and have a bit of fun and watch some YouTube films. So even there, so that just, to me, it illustrates the fact that it has changed our world in many ways in a very short space of time. This is what my home screen looks like on my smartphone. I'm using folders, so inside each folder there are various apps, and I probably use about a dozen of these apps every day. The one at the bottom right corner, you wouldn't recognize, most of you. It's an app that measures my blood sugar, you see, because I'm a diabetic. I got ill some years ago, and that turned me into diabetic. And I have a sensor which is attached to my arm, and I can just move my phone over my arm, and it measures the blood sugar. And the blood sugar level is okay, but you see, it almost looks like a mountain change on New Guinea. It goes up and down because I'm too fond of food, but I can regulate it. And I use my smartphone in order to monitor my blood sugar. Just as one example of the millions, I would almost say, of different things for which we use the smartphone these days. Not all of us, but most of us. I haven't seen the latest statistics for Italy, but in Norway, the saturation of smartphones in the population is more than 90%. More than 90%. Some people resist. Some of them are academics. I sometimes feel that I know half of the people in Norway who don't have a smartphone, but the vast majority do. And it's so taken for granted that at the university where I work, you'd better have a smartphone if you want to park your car, okay? Until last year, we had these little stickers that you put on the windscreen, on the inside of the windscreen, which said that you were allowed to park your car in a university area, okay? Whether you were an employee or a student or administration, different stickers. And you had to renew those stickers every 2 years. Since last year, we no longer use those stickers. We have an app that enables us to park our cars. You register your plate, your number plate, and the rest is more or less automatic. So without a smartphone, you may be towed away from the university car park. It's so ubiquitous that it's considered a natural extension of the body in our part of the world. But as I'm coming to in a little while, it has also changed lives in a big way in the global south, but in different ways, but in some similar ways as well. Isn't that what we're doing in anthropology? Looking for similarities and differences. So what is this about? And why did it catch on in such a big way so quickly? I think one answer is, and here I am, and have been for many years, inspired by the French theorist with the Italian name Paul Virilio, who wrote about speed, many books about speed, and in fact who invented, in a way, his own science of dromology, the science about speed. And Virilio was a cultural pessimist, but he was also very insightful. And he was the one who taught me many years ago that in fact modernity is addicted to acceleration. It's dependent on it, it relies on it, and it's also addicted to speed. If you have a culture which is addicted to speed, you can't get enough of it. If you get a new computer, which is a bit faster than the previous one, it's great. If you get a new train, which is faster than you used to have, you'll move to that train, even if it costs a lot by way of investment. And you dream about the time when there are no delays. You know, Virgilio actually says that, you know, in the information age, he wrote about the information age and the computer age of internet, computers, that in the age of the internet, there are no longer any delays. You know, he's exaggerating. In the digital world, this may be true, but in the physical world, not. And this is also one of the things that I'd like to focus on in this talk, the contrast between the digital and the physical world, the way in which they adhere to different rhythms, that there is a slowness about the physical world, which sometimes, you know, is out of sync with the digital. And this is well known, but it deserves to be explored, not least now that we are enmeshed in and dependent on and reliant on the smartphone, probably to a much greater extent than we were before February, March 2020. I mean, you know, crises are magnifying glasses and accelerators, aren't they? And some things are being magnified and other things are being sped up. And one of the things that have been sped up is the general digitalization of culture, which I know that some of you are talking about during this conference. So it's a cultural addiction. You can't get enough. Since the Industrial Revolution, the faster is better. Think about the time of the Napoleonic Wars. Early 19th century. If you were to travel from Europe to America, it could still take months because it depended on the winds and on the weather, how long it took. You know, because you were traveling with sail ships. A little bit later, the first steamships came, which had steamboats that enabled you to, in fact, know, you could predict more or less how long it took to travel from Bristol to New York. But still, it took a while. So at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, that was before the steamboat, whenever a ship from Europe arrived, American newspapers, the newspapers in New York would typically have headlines about, you know, HMS so-and-so arrived, you know, yesterday from Bristol. And here are some of the news it brought from Europe. And the news would be maybe about Napoleon having lost his wars, now being, you know, exiled to St. Helena, you know, various bits of news. The point is that this news might be several months old, okay, 2-3 months. It could take that long for news to reach America from Europe. Then things were sped up a bit with the steamship, which was great. But then came the first real revolution in information technology since the invention of the printing press, namely the telegraph and the transatlantic telegraph cable. The first transatlantic telegraph cable, I mean, there were several unsuccessful attempts during the 1850s, but the first successful transatlantic telegraph cable was opened in 1866. And it went from, you know, Western Ireland to Newfoundland in Canada. That was the shortest, you know, distance across the Atlantic. And from there, you know, it would, you know, overland, the cable would reach the big cities like New York and Philadelphia, or London and Manchester, which meant that just in the space of a few decades, the time that it took news to travel across the Atlantic was reduced from perhaps several months to a couple of weeks, and then to just 1 hour. You could transmit the message across the Atlantic in just 1 hour, in Morse code. Think about this, you know, that was a revolution. And it has been said, I don't agree with it, but it's an interesting thought, okay? It has been said that, in fact, the internet is just a footnote to the telegraph, because the telegraph represented the first instance by which you could transmit a message without there being a physically accompanying object. In a way, it was the beginning of the digital revolution, right? There was no physical object, no letter, no piece of paper that had to be moved. It was just signals, Morse signals. So at the time, the Times of London published an editorial in 1866 after the successful opening of the first transatlantic telegraph cable, where they said that this event is probably the greatest achievement of mankind since the building of the great pyramids. Sounds like an exaggeration, doesn't it? But I have often thought that, you know, blimey, maybe they were right. It was a revolution. It was a huge, huge event. Now, the picture that I'm showing you is, it's a picture of one of the ships that laid out the cable across the Atlantic. We're talking about a fairly impressive feat of engineering and of you know, skill to create those cables with the technology they had at hand in the mid-19th century. So this was a time of optimism. And then this time of optimism and of acceleration continued. And I just like, as a footnote, to mention one of my favorite examples of acceleration, namely the pneumatic tube system. It was the future. The pneumatic tubes, they were a network, you know, of underground tubes, still in use in some hospitals, even today, as a backup in case digital communication doesn't work. If the network is not working, you can use these tubes to send canisters, you know, with CT scans or important documents or even medicines or even blood samples. So they're still in use in a very limited way in certain hospitals. But when the pneumatic tube was introduced in the 1860s and 70s, the idea was that they should replace the slow and sluggish overland transportation of small parcels, typically, and letters and important documents, which had to be moved by horse carriage or by some kind of errand boy, okay, a runner. It took a while, you know, to go from Manhattan to Brooklyn that way. With the pneumatic tube system, the underground network of these tubes that sent, you know, with almost lightning speed, these little sort of capsules with various documents and other things. It took only a few minutes from post office to post office, or from bank to stock exchange, or from big hotel to some other location. So it was a future. You know, in the early 20th century, the pneumatic tube system was still the future. It became a metaphor for the future way of living. In London, people still talk about the underground railway system as the tube. You know, so it's just an expanded. You know, it's just a magnified version of the small pneumatic tubes that were used for mail. This was a tube system for humans. And today, there's a revival of this idea. Think about Elon Musk and his Hyperloop vision for, traveling through some kind of pneumatic tube system with a bullet train from San Francisco to Los Angeles in just 1 hour. Of course, you can't see any of the scenery, and it's worthless, it's uncomfortable, it's unpleasant, but it's fast. And that's it. That's the selling point. It's faster than the alternatives. So these were just a couple of stories from an earlier phase in modernity, which illustrates the way in which we are addicted to speed. And you know, I mean, when you become accustomed to something which is really fast, you must feel that the technology of the last decade is unbearably slow. I mean, if you and I were to use a Windows computer from the late 1980s, for example, and try to do anything meaningful with it, surf on the web, whatever, it would have been impossible, you know, because the waiting time might have been, you know, half a minute or more, whereas we're accustomed to maybe 1 or 2 seconds. Or if you are accustomed to traveling from Tokyo to Osaka on the Shinkansen, you know, the Japanese bullet train, if you were to take the train from Oslo to Bergen, okay, the 2 major cities in Norway, you'd think that, you know, the slowness of that train was just unbearably, you know, comical, unbelievable. You know, it stops every now and then it sort of goes up the hill, and then it stops at a little station and thinks a while before moving on, and so on. So becoming accustomed to speed makes it very difficult to go back to something which is slower. Our culture, as I said, which is addicted to speed. Now, the big story about this is the story of capitalism and growth. make no mistake, it's capitalism and the growth economy which drives this. But that's not the topic of this lecture. We'll talk about that some other time. So let's move on to the present. Let me then fast forward to the contemporary age, and we've all seen these graphs, haven't we? That illustrate accelerated growth and fast growth in internet use. And in some ways, it's even more dramatic in some places that it may look on this simple graph, where internet is now almost universal in the North Atlantic part of the world, and it has become incredibly widespread in sub-Saharan Africa and India, and not least China, for example. So, and it has been difficult to predict the speed of the spread of the internet and the smartphone. So as late as 2012, an anthropological article about internet and smartphones and mobile phones in India was published. And the authors, they saw that, this may become fairly widespread in a little while. At the time, in 2012, there were something like 17 million smartphones in India. And their prediction was that, maybe, in 5 years, maybe there will be 70 million. So we can predict a very fast development, a very fast growth in the number of smartphones. But what happened was, in fact, that the number went from, about 15 million to several hundred million. I think we're talking about 300 million in 5 years. I wrote a book back in that Bruno Riccio mentioned back in 2006 called Globalization, the Key Concepts, where I mentioned that, in fact, Africa, south of Sahara, has very poor internet coverage, talking about between 2 and 3%. If you bracket South Africa, which has a different history, which has been an industrial society for 100 years or more, 2 or 3%, so it's much, much less. Then I was asked to revise the book in 2014, 7 years later. So I had to check in all the figures, everything had to be updated. And it then turned out that the current figure for Africa was between 20 and 25%. So that's a tenfold increase in 7 years. And if you look at the internet statistics today for the African continent, bar South Africa and the 5 North African countries, which also have a different history, it would be somewhere between 35 and 40%. So you go into fairly poor villages where people don't have plumbing, they don't have tap water, they may not have a regular electricity supply, but many of the families have mobile phones, and quite a few of them have smartphones. So it has been dramatic. Just let me just remind you of, or remind ourselves of, the fact that there is always an infrastructure. There's always an explanation for the rapid spread of this kind of technology. Certain conditions have to be in place. I mean, there was a fiber optic cable that was laid around along the coast of West Africa, enabling fairly reliable, not incredibly reliable, but fairly reliable access to the internet, but also the reduced cost and the new trading relationships between China and Africa. One of the new Silk Roads is a globalization from below, studied by people like the anthropologist Gordon Matthews, who works in Hong Kong, who's written about this place called Chungking Mansions in Hong Kong, which is a place of bad reputation in Hong Kong. It's a ramshackle, rundown place associated with shady business, with fake gold, and with lots of foreigners who come in and so on. And anyway, this is a big sort of trading emporium for wholesale trading mainly, but also detail trading, where African traders come in from Nigeria and Zambia and Cote d'Ivoire, and they buy up large numbers of large entities, of smartphones, cheap smartphones. So had it not been for the chunking mansions, that's my point, is the spread of the internet in Africa would have been much slower. Gordon Matthews estimated at one time, during the childhood of the smartphone, that possibly as much as a quarter of all the smartphones in Africa have passed through chunking mansions in Hong Kong. This is probably no longer the case because there are many other similar hubs in Guangzhou and so on. But the point is that had it not been for these new Silk Roads, these new trade connections, globalization from below, often on a very small scale, often business is on a shoestring, very often in the informal sector. Many of the changes that we are witnessing, for example, in the African continent today, would not have come about. And I'm coming to that in a little while. I don't have to spend a lot of time on this because we all know it, but we should still reflect on the speed with which the smartphone has entered the world and contributed to changing the lives and the sort of the lives we live. In 2007, when the first iPhone was introduced, it was launched in September 2007, just 102 million sold, probably a few other brands, but mainly Apple. And by 2019, 1,500 million, 1.5 billion smartphones were sold. How many smartphones are in circulation in the world today? Nobody knows exactly, but the number is estimated at somewhere between 3.7 billion and 4 billion, which means that, you know, if there's 7.7 billion of us all together, 1 in 2 has a smartphone, including people in the Amazon, young people, poor people, people in isolated Pacific islands. So make no mistake, it is changing the way in which we relate to each other. And it says something, as the COVID-19 pandemic has, about the density of global connections and the vulnerabilities that result. So the acceleration that I've been talking about and the addiction to speed also entails and has entailed intensified transnational connections and intensified dependence and vulnerabilities, as we have been reminded of in these during this strange last year. Now, what do people use smartphones for? We anthropologists look for diversity, and we always find it because there is a lot of diversity. But if we want to take the bird's eye perspective just for a minute, it's quite clear that there are certain affordances that the smartphone offers and certain things that we use smartphones for in a very general sense. Services, all kinds of services, like parking my car or checking my blood sugar, you know, or booking an appointment with at the hairdressers, if the hairdresser is open, if they've been allowed to open, or buying theater tickets, or buying a train ticket, or whatever. So all kinds of services. Checking your bank account. Social networks. Anything from the dyadic, you know, sending a text message, phoning people, where we're always available. You know, that was a big innovation of the big sort of sociological change when the mobile phone was introduced 30 years ago, the new mobile phones. Not the smartphone necessarily, but the mobile phone, was the fact that with the introduction of the mobile phone, each and every one of us was available any time of the day, wherever we were, by anybody else, by anybody else. In the dim and distant past of my youth, you know, we had landlines, you know, we didn't have mobile phones, which meant that when you left the office, or if you weren't at home, people might be able to leave a message on an answering machine, but they couldn't reach you, so you were free. So the social networks are of many kinds. Some of them are dyadic, some of them are more complex. You know, the mobile phone sociologist Rich Ling, who's published extensively on this theme, speaks about micro-coordination, but he also speaks increasingly about micro-coordination 2.0. That's a new sort of twist of micro-coordination made possible by the social media and the smartphone. Micro-coordination 2.0 means that you micro-coordinate your movements with lots of people, not just with one. And it means that we no longer have to make appointment way ahead. You can adjust your appointments as you go along. You don't have to say, let's meet on Saturday at noon. You can say, let's find out. And you can text them from the tram or the bus and say, sorry, I'm a bit late. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Or can we change, can we move this appointment for an hour? And they will return the message fairly immediately, or you expect them to. So social networks, big aspects of, and it's ubiquitous everywhere. Everybody who uses smartphones uses them for social networking in one way or another. So that's one universal. And what we have found is that, in fact, the thick relations, the strong ties that you have with a few people remain fairly constant in spite of the affordances of the smartphone and the social media, which means that if something dramatic happens, there would be typically between 3 and 5 other people whom you would contact immediately, between 3 and 5 other people. If there's a volcanic eruption, if there's a terrorist attack, if there's a big sort of natural disaster, there are between 3 and 5 other people. And this seems to be constant in spite of the fact that we now have the possibility of contacting hundreds of others. But the weak ties that the sociologist Mark Granovetter wrote about in his famous article, The Strength of Weak Ties from 1973, those weak ties can be expanded almost indefinitely. Right? You can know thousands of people a little bit. It's almost scale-free. It can be scaled almost indefinitely. So that's the second thing that we use smartphones for everywhere, in different ways. Third thing, information and disinformation, where, and we know a lot about this after these 4 years of a very strange presidency in the United States. So all kinds of information and disinformation. Entertainment, yeah, that goes without saying. These 4 aspects or kinds of families of affordances provided by the smartphone are fairly universal. We can recognize them everywhere in the world, but they're used in very different ways. And that's where anthropology comes in. There's variation, there's diversity, and not least because the smartphone is not an extension, it's not the phone. That's the first chapter. I've just written a book about the smartphone, which is being published in a couple of months. The first chapter is called This is Not the Phone. And it's quite obvious. We thought it was, but it isn't. We make phone calls fairly rarely, but we spend a lot of time on screen. So it's a polymedium, as our colleague Danny Miller puts it. Marshall McLuhan, the 1960s and 70s media theorist, he spoke about technologies as extensions. His famous book from 1964, Understanding Media, has the subtitle Extensions of Man. Now, this was before we had gender-sensitive language, okay? So, extensions of man, understanding media. And so he sees, the book or print as an extension of the eye, the radio as an extension of the air, and so on, which is an interesting way of going about it. But what is the smartphone an extension of? Is it the brain? Is it the hand? It's hard to tell because it affects so many. It's just like the COVID-19 pandemic, it affects so many dimensions of our lives that it eludes that sort of reductionist description. So there's variation, there's diversity. In our part of the world, in Europe and North America, there's a big industry now of there's a lot of worried literatures, perhaps especially in the Protestant part of the North Atlantic world about the smartphone, that it makes us stupid because we outsource the brain. And the general logic, I think, which probably has to do with some idea about personhood and authenticity, is that if you take stuff out of your brain and you put it in here, there's less left here. The more you put here, the less you have left in your brain. So the more you rely on your phone to get information, whether it's on Google Maps or Wikipedia, the less there's left here. In other parts of the world, interestingly, the discourse is very different. In Africa, there doesn't seem to be that kind of worried discourse about the smartphone at all. The authorities, the elites, are just concerned with how they can use smartphone affordances and technology to contribute to economic growth. And they do so quite successfully in some places. In Korea, in South Korea, which is interesting in that it is, like the Scandinavian countries, the place in the world with the highest saturation of smartphones in the population. It may be almost 100%. So everybody has one, okay? And in Korea, turns out that when people are asked about this and they're interviewed about knowledge and, does it make you stupid and so on, the general view is that the smartphone, in fact, makes them smarter because you have all of this information at your fingertips, which to me, as an anthropologist, perhaps, says something about different ideas about personhood. For us, the person stops at the skin. Everything that's beyond the skin is not me. Maybe in South Korea, maybe, I wouldn't know, but that is an assumption reading this research. Maybe to them, the boundary between the self and the outside world is not as clear. So that as long as you have your phone, that's part of you. And if it can tell you the name of the capital in Colombia, then fine, not a problem. Doesn't make us more stupid, makes us smarter. I see that I have a number of other things I want to say, so I'll try to be a bit quick now. Micro-coordination 2.0, I've already talked about that, about the group chat. This is, by the way, an image from the IASA conference, the virtual IASA conference, which should have been in Lisbon, but which was online. So I was, in fact, sitting in exactly this sofa in front of this same painting from Australia, talking about conviviality. And so micro-coordination makes it possible for us to be together, even if we are not together. But keep in mind that there is a tension here. There is always a tension. I mean, there's a duality. There's a contradiction in everything the smartphone stands for. It makes us smarter. It makes us more stupid. It expands our world, but it also shrinks our world. It's reductionist, but it also, it also offers new dimensions, and perhaps it makes us more sociable, more connected, but also lonelier. So Sherry Turkle, who's written about new technologies from an STS perspective for many years, has this book called Alone Together. And maybe this is what we are right now. Maybe we're alone together. I don't know. Do we become lonelier or less lonely? There is no simple answer to this, but it's an interesting question to ask. And it turns out that it's contextual. I have a friend who's become severely disabled. He has a handicap, okay? Because he had an accident. So he's in a wheelchair. He's even in an electric wheelchair. He can move his arms a bit, just enough, for him to, to tap into his virtual electronic networks. And he's an intellectual, so he's engaged on Facebook and sends off messages and watches films on YouTube and reads articles. And to him, had it not been for this technology, he would have been very lonely because he would have had to sit around and wait for someone to visit. And perhaps the COVID-19 pandemic has also taught us something about the relationship between physical and digital presence. And I would say that it's an empirical question. There's no simple answer, quite obviously. Now, yes, of course, deterritorialized communication is also one dimension that that is universal and which is being used almost everywhere, it seems. And it's reductionist. That's the first fact about the smartphone, isn't it? That it's reductionist because it squeezes everything into, if you can't get it into an app, if you can't get it into this screen, it doesn't exist. It's a bit like the world of PowerPoint, isn't it? If you can't present your argument in 3 bullet points, then it's worthless. And as anthropologists, obviously, we resist this way of reducing the world, but we have to be mindful of the way in which it's taking place and what it does. Everybody, as I say, becomes small, flat. They have no smell and they have no body language. And it makes us, perhaps digitalization more than anything else, it teaches us something about physical presence, physical co-presence. What Anthony Giddens many years ago spoke about as presence availability, which he saw already then in the early 90s as a scarce resource, presence availability, being there, simply, being there with other people. I'll now move very quickly on to my final questions. I mean, after having provided all this context and some reflections on the importance of the smartphone, to what extent it synchronizes us, makes us live at the same time, makes us simultaneous, contemporaries. This is a big theme in anthropology. Clifford Geertz wrote about it in his in several of his articles about the ways in which people can be contemporary without knowing about each other. Benedict Anderson, Imagine Communities, is very much about synchronization. It's very much about creating a sense of abstract identity whereby people live, as it were, in the same time and are simultaneous, contemporary with each other. So it's a subject with an honorable history. So I'm just asking, to what extent does a smartphone synchronize it? Well, it seems on the face of it that it does, because we're all simultaneous, aren't we? And it's so ubiquitous that in Qatar, they even have an app that is mandatory, just like the parking app that we have in my working place, okay? They have an app which is mandatory that you have to download and which follows your movements and enables the authorities to trace people who are infected. And it's called Etras, this Qatari app. So to sum up the argument so far, and don't worry, I'll finish very soon, okay? But I have a few other things I want to say. Some of the things that the smartphone does everywhere, it miniaturizes. Everything is being squeezed into this screen. So it's reductionist in its nature. It standardizes, because if you can't get it into an app, it doesn't exist. And the apps are more or less the same everywhere. And it platformizes, so that you become reliant on particular platforms and their affordances. So the people who write the algorithms become very powerful, just as the people who built the railways in the 19th century and the highways in the 20th century. They could decide where people should go and which places could become overheated and which places were cooled down. I have examples of some places quite near Oslo which were booming in the 19th century as new industrial centers. And they then somehow, they faded away and are now backwaters. And mentally, to us, they're further away than Rome or Paris, because we never go there. Places which are just 40 minutes away from here. And one main explanation is that the railway didn't go there. The railway went in another direction. So they were left behind. So in the same way, analogous with the building of the physical infrastructure, the people who create the algorithms, they can, I'm not saying that they determine the way we work and the way we think, but they shape the way we work in important ways. And it accelerates, it creates efficiency. Just wanted to show you the dummy of the new book. This is the Norwegian version, The Planet of the Apps, okay? Not the planet of the apes, but the planet of the apps. How the smartphone changed the world, being published in Norwegian in January, and hopefully in some other languages later on. So now very quickly towards the end, how does then the synchronization that I have alluded to through talking about global networks, standardization of apps, and the now almost ubiquitous presence of smartphones everywhere in the world, how does that relate to desynchronization? How can we even say that it desynchronizes? Because that's what I'm going to argue towards the end, that in fact the smartphone, yes, it synchronizes, but it also desynchronizes in important ways. In other words, makes us less contemporary in some ways. But clearly it improves efficiency, it synchronizes. I mean, think about working in a market. You have a market stall somewhere in Africa, in Lusaka, for example, and you sell vegetables. But you see, before lunch, you run out of tomatoes. And there are lots of people who want to buy tomatoes. In the past, until around 2016, you had to wait for a day or two or three for the guy to come around on his scooter, to bring you some more tomatoes. Now you can text him. You can text the wholesaler and say that, look, if you arrive, if you can send your errand boy within a few minutes or within an hour, with a crate of tomatoes. I'll pay you 20% extra. And he'll do it because he gets 20% extra. So it accelerates the economy in this way, enhances efficiency, and not least in countries where many of us work as anthropologists, which have a poorly developed formal sector. It clearly increases the efficiency and logistics of the market, for better and worse. But many people profit from it. Mobile payment service, which have become big in various parts of the global south, which enables you to transfer money, small and large sums, to make payments, to send, a few euros to your mother who lives in a different city without using Western Union and without opening a bank account. All you need is to have a smartphone, and lots of people do. So the mobile payment services, this photo is from Kenya, where this was first introduced. He's got an old-fashioned phone, but he can still use it for mobile banking. Where the M-Pesa system was introduced a little more than a decade ago, enabling fast and easy transfer of money. Quite clearly, this synchronizes. It makes people contemporary. M-Pesa, yeah. So another example, refugees. As I announced, maybe a couple of words about refugees. In the project in which I have been involved on waiting among refugees, starting from the so-called refugee crisis of 2015-2016, about which you know a lot in Italy and in the Mediterranean countries in general, and been part of this project on waiting, because as you know, most of the time refugees are not really moving, they're waiting. They're sitting around waiting for their lives to begin again, for their asylum application to be dealt with by the authorities, or for a job to materialize, and so on. So we were looking at waiting, and my bit in it had to do with the smartphone. And we spoke to people, in Marseille, for example, who had arrived. They'd made it across the Mediterranean. There was a young man who said that, I can't even imagine how it was possible to move across the Mediterranean and to be a refugee in Europe without a smartphone, because he uses it all the time for Google Maps, texting, finding out how to cross, finding out where the transport is, and arriving in Marseille, downloading apps which enable him to find out where he can get a meal, who can help him with his asylum application, where can he find people who speak his language, and so on and so forth. So he can't imagine how it was possible before the smartphone. So it's quite clearly, I'd say that on the whole, for refugees, empowering, and mainly it's synchronizing. It makes them simultaneous. People who have worked in the refugee camps in the Middle East report that many of the Syrians who fled 2015, 2016 didn't have a smartphone before they left, but they bought one just before they left or just after arriving in Jordan or Lebanon, because they knew that they were going to need it, which they did. So it's clearly mainly synchronizing. But, and so on the whole, the smartphone, it confirms, David Harvey's analysis of late capitalism, which he associates with, or which he has sort of described as representing time-space compression, which is a very good sort of compact way of talking about globalization, isn't it? Time and space are being compressed. And on the whole, this is the main narrative, I guess, about the smartphone and about 21st century global neoliberal capitalism. But there are other stories as well. It can also lead to expansion of time and space. For example, your space grows virtually. Maybe you're not able to move. You're stuck where you are. But mentally, your space grows. Socially, your space grows. In Danny Miller's project on social media, he reports that, in rural China, many, especially young girls, for the first time in their lives, they discover or they are able to have a private life, some privacy. because they can have friends or acquaintances or people they network with online, on their phone, that their brothers or neighbors or parents don't know about. And we've seen similar patterns in other parts of the world, where in fact your social space, it expands. And also your physical space in a way expands, because you become aware of parts of the world and places that you have never been and may never go to, but you become aware of their existence. So it's not as simple as that. And then I said something about delays. Well, in the physical world, there are delays. And perhaps one of the frustrations experienced everywhere in different ways, but which is endemic to the smartphone, is the friction between the physical life and the online life. The online life is without friction. It's fast, it's super fast. It's become so easy to spend money, to buy a ticket somewhere, to get information on Wikipedia about whatever, to entertain yourself on YouTube or Netflix. But then you have the physical world, which follows different rhythms, different temporality. So maybe one of the things we should do more research on is the clash of rhythms, clashing temporalities in the context of digitalization. Certain things, as you know, can only be done slowly, such as making Parma ham or Parmesan cheese or cooking Italian food. It can only be done in a particular way. Some things have to be done fast, like cooking the pasta. Other things have to be done slowly, like making the sauce. Growing a tree, having children, getting to know yourself. There are so many things that can only be done slowly. And they are all things that we do in the physical world, where there is friction, there is resistance, and there is simply a different temporality from what you have online. And reflecting on this, it makes me think about something that, of all people, Margaret Mead wrote about in the 1950s, where she wrote about cultural change in Melanesia after the Second World War, because some changes had taken place really fast. Excuse me. owing to the Second World War. You know, I mean, you read about the cargo cults, about the way in which Japanese and Americans brought in modernity, money, capitalist economy, commodification, etc. But other parts of their society didn't seem to change that much at all. The kinship system remained constant. Many of the beliefs remained constant. So what she said was that different parts of a culture change at different speeds, which is a sort of a clunky mid-20th century cultural anthropology way of talking, but you see the point, and it's well observed. Different parts of a culture change at different speeds, and perhaps different parts of our lives now are committed to different and sometimes conflicting rhythms. Maybe this is a way of thinking about the smartphone that is really about temporality. It's about the way in which the different rhythms clash and conflict. And you would have discovered, just like me, that after the onset of the pandemic, we've become so efficient when we have meetings online, haven't we? Because you go straight to the point. There's no small talk about what you did during the weekend and pass me the coffee and can I have a biscuit? We go straight on. And because it's so incredibly boring to be in online meetings that you just want to get it over with. So we become very, very fast, right? Everything is fast because it's without friction. You can go straight on. You don't even have to move. You can stay at home and go to the meeting. And you can go straight on to a new meeting in a different city. We become more flexible regarding space, right? We can be wherever we want to be, and communicate with the world. It doesn't really matter where you are. But we can become less flexible regarding time, because all the gaps are being filled with various forms of digital activity, whether it's entertainment, information or disinformation, networking or services. So there is something, there are flexibility losses and gains. And I think much of this can be studied by looking at the friction between temporalities, between the temporalities of the physical world, where there is resistance, there is friction, there are delays, and there are certain rhythms, some of which are even biological, and the instantaneous, accelerated rhythm of the online world. But finally, I'm finishing now, but finally, the final thing I'd like to say is there are other things. There are so many aspects that could be explored, and I problematized already the idea of time-space compression, saying that, well, sometimes we can talk about time-space expansion, because you can delay responding to messages, for example. You can do it. You don't have to do it immediately. You can wait for a couple of days. Whereas in the physical world, when someone comes up to you, you have to talk to them right now. You can't say, well, I'll respond to your question in 2 days. So in some ways, become more flexible. Right? We can stretch time out. And so keep in mind also that there is something paradoxical about the information which is stored on the internet and that we access on the mobile phone. Most of the time, it's ephemeral, it's instantaneous. It's here now and it's gone in the next moment. I mean, the snapshot information just moves at a frightful speed and is being replaced, by new information all the time. Whereas at the same time, that very same information, which we think of as ephemeral and instantaneous, with a use-by date, which is in 2 minutes, it also stays there forever, right? It's gone in a second and it stays there forever. And that is I think that is also a fascinating thing about the way in which the temporalities of the internet work, because it's a kind of what the speaks of as timeless time. Time sort of lifted, disembedded. So it's here now, gone in the next moment, but it's also, there forever. So if someone wants to find some dirt about you, they want to dig up some dirt about you, something stupid that you've done in the past, they can find it online, even if it was 20 years ago. And had it not been for the archive, the museum function of the online world, this would not have happened. So anyway, I end here, well, thank you very much for your attention and for being here with me.
Thank you very much, Thomas.
Questions.
Thank you very much. And imagine a huge applause that we cannot reproduce with the digital devices. There are, I've got many things to say, but I've seen that also in the audience there are questions written online, like what about the digital divide, someone, or how now it was the ritual beer with colleagues in the pub after Friday seminar. I think I will allow the people to jump in. Please do ask using the chat, and then I close my microphone and you can speak to Thomas and to the others.
Yeah. Well, there's one question already that I see here about the digital divide.
Yes.
Which is obviously very important. I mean, during the pandemic, many schools now have moved to online teaching. In some countries, this is unproblematic, at least in the sense that you can assume that children have internet at home so that they can take part in online teaching, but not in India. I mean, in India, you would assume that altogether in the country, maybe half of the kids, maybe slightly less than half, and most of them in the cities would have access to internet and would be able to follow online teaching, and the others would simply be excluded. So quite clearly, this is one form of digital divide, but we can also sometimes turn it on its head. In some settings, the digital divide, in fact, divides the people who are addicted to the digital world, who are addicted to the smartphones, as victims, as slaves to the technology, in a kind of brave new world sort of meaning on the one hand, and those people who in fact have the possibility to turn them off and who don't have to make themselves available. So maybe inaccessibility, not being available, is becoming a scarce resource. And if you can afford not to be available 24 out of 7, that shows that you belong to a very sort of exclusive part of the population.
I think this is what Barbara Sorgoni meant using a joke much before, in the middle of your speech. There is a clear question by Donatella Schmidt from University of Padua. Since digital information move at incredible speed, is it more difficult to transform them into knowledge? This is her question.
Yes.
And then Alessandra Polidori will ask a question, and we. But before you answer to Donatella Schmidt, and then we allow Alessandra Polidori to speak with the microphone. So the question was, since digital information move at incredible speed.
Oh, yeah, you answered. Yeah. Right, I thought we were waiting for another question. Absolutely. You know, I think that if we want to understand these strange new political movements that we are seeing around the world now, this is one way of looking at them. It's one lens through which to look at these, you know, I might say populist, anti-elite, center political movements. There are other causes, but that's one of them, is to do with speed. Is to do with the fact that information is now, it travels so fast. So the problem with the current debates on Facebook and so on is not so much democratization, which some say, that now everybody is allowed to speak and many of them don't know anything. They should shut up and let knowledgeable people talk. I don't think that's a problem. The problem is simply the speed, that you don't have the time to think. Because if you do have the time to think, and you speak to your friends about it or to other people, and they would say that, well, maybe you should look at it this way. Maybe it's not as simple. And then you realize that things are a little bit more complicated. So the general tendency to simplify, I think, is crucial. You know, many years ago, during postmodernism, or when postmodernism first came, the anthropologist Ernest Gellner, who didn't like postmodernism, okay, he was a rationalist, he was asked about it. And they said that, you know, I think that the reason for postmodernism's popularity is that there's a great demand for obscurity. That may or may not have been true, I don't know. Or maybe it was just trying to make a joke. But I think today, that is not the problem at all. The problem is that there's a great demand for simple answers to complex questions. And the smartphone and that kind of speed, information speed, contributes to the simplification.
Okay, very clear. Thank you. So Alessandra Polidori, if you want to.
Hi.
Yes.
Can I? Do you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. First of all, thanks for this interesting interview, because your book was a great inspiration for my work. I'm a PhD student in University of Perugia, so mainly of my work is based on overeating. So thank you. And my field of research is about young people and acceleration and identity. So I was about asking you, is this synchronization, de-synchronization rhetoric, how did it impact on the young people conception of life and biography? So if you can give me some, I don't know, clues about how this is affect also the young people. I don't know if it was enough clear. I can repeat it, but
no, I think that's. I think it's very clear, but it's. There are many ways of approaching your question. But I think, you know, one of the things that we've seen increasingly since the Second World War. I mean, not all of this is new. Some scholars speak about the great acceleration as starting in the late 1940s. And you can see that, yeah, I mean, some things start to accelerate then in terms of the economy and communication. The first satellites, you know, TV satellites, they were operating already in the 1950s. But since the 1990s, there's been a sort of an acceleration. But since the 1950s and onwards, if we look at young people, we've seen a globalization of youth culture as a phenomenon, you know, as a standardized phenomenon. So that being a young person means almost the same. I wouldn't say everywhere, but there are many commonalities because people are exposed to many of the same influences. So, for example, in Seychelles, where I have some work, I have some projects, okay, in the Indian Ocean, they have a Creole culture. Most of the people in Seychelles are descendants of slaves. They have a sort of that kind of story. But young people in Seychelles don't really want to be Seychellois, and they don't want to relate to their own history. They want to be a kind of Americans. So they emulate American culture. So what we're getting here is perhaps a form of mimicry, which is mediated in a very accelerated way by the social media. And if you think about, those increasingly dense and fast networks that connect us around the world, we will see that increasingly people in different parts of the world are exposed to many of the same influences. So they would develop some commonalities. Problem is, of course, that the physical world may differ. The physical world makes it very difficult for people in Seychelles to behave as if they were Americans, because they're poorer, for one thing. They don't have the kind of money that they do in America. And there are also other things. So you get this sort of, I wouldn't call it a digital divide, but a gap, a clash between the physical world, which has certain limitations, and the digital worlds, which gives you some ideals. We have some research from Nigeria, fascinating stuff from, I could send you the reference if you drop me a line.
Thank you, I'd like to.
From Southeast Nigeria, where young women, they use Facebook and the social media in order to produce for themselves a kind of dream world that they know will never come about, but they can pretend when they're online to live in that world. Right?
Okay.
Thank you very much. Very clear.
Thomas, since you talked about the ambivalence of our times and the fact that time-space compression can be also the opposite, to make an exercise of keeping in time. So we've got Selenia Marabello question that she will ask to you, then Sara Bonfanti, who wrote, Mara Bernaduzzi, who wrote for me as a mistake, but I will ask the question, and Barbara Sorgoni. I would, if you agree, I would do like that. First, a question of Selenia, and then the other three, you collect the three, and you conclude the lecture.
Yeah.
Okay, Selenia, short and sharp, please.
Short and sharp. Thank you very much for your lecture and for accepting our invitation. And I would like to move, because I'm very interested in the relation between technology and mobility and health. And I'm asking, moving a little bit on what you know very well, which is nationalism. So thinking with you, could we say that thinking about the campaign on COVID-19 vaccination, can we say that we are on the verge of immunonationalism? Or can we say that we are going toward a sort of immunonationalism if we think about the political negotiation concerning the vaccination and stuff like this? This idea of tracing people and at the same time to create a sort of new identity connected with health and technology could be a sort of new nationalism. What do you think about?
Yes, I think I think you're right. But you know, when the internet was new in the 1990s, many of us believed that this heralded a new era of a more cosmopolitan attitude to the world, because you could now communicate with everyone. You could get information from all over the world, and it would become less sort of confined to your own national space. That did not happen. Instead, what we see is the emergence of echo chambers of, in fact, smaller entities than the nation and so on. And what you're talking about is the way in which the state would use information technology and the scare of health issues in order to consolidate and strengthen the nation. I mean, one of the striking things about the COVID-19 pandemic is the way in which foreigners have become suspicious. You know, foreigners are put into quarantine hotels, at least in this country, and are treated in a different way from locals. And yes, and surveillance. And as always, nowadays we have to look at China to see what the future looks like, what they're doing there. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Thomas, now I read you 3 questions, and then there is someone asking for another oral question, and we will see if we can squeeze her in, Greca Meloni. Whereas as a gentlewoman, our president withdrew her question because it's, and I agree, it's good that our members ask questions. Okay. Sara Bonfanti, thanks Thomas for covering the many dimensions now this flatland that the smartphone allows. One question: how would you rate the backlash of social media being accused of magging part of our privacy / personal identities without us even being aware? See the social dilemma, docu-movie, blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
Then Barbara Sorgoni, comment, reflection on one of the last issues, example, becoming more efficient with online meetings at work, no small talks or biscuits, yet when smart working overlapped with the pandemics and the impossibility to meet colleagues in person, also the opposite happened. Working meetings also became a way to share more than it would happen in normal times. So she was looking at the other side of the coin of what we stressed before, you stressed before. And then Chiara Bassetti, connecting directly with what Barbara Sorgoni said, adding, although laterally, to Sorgoni's comment, I would not say that the body language is completely absent in the smart work environment. So you stimulated us to juggle with the ambivalence you stressed.
Yes,
please.
Thanks very much, Bruno, and thanks everybody for questions. I think we're all sort of on the same page here, trying to make sense of what has happened, and not least in the current context of the pandemic, which has accelerated the digitalization of so many activities. And has taught us, I mean, about the digital, but also about the physical world. You know, I mean, these possibilities for having video conferences, for having things like Zoom conferences have existed for a long time, but we've hardly ever made use of them. We would always still get up at 5:30 in the morning to catch an early flight, you know, and it would cost money. It's not good for the environment. It took a lot of time. Of course, going to Italy is one thing. That's always very nice. But having to go to Stockholm or Copenhagen just to examine a master's thesis, we're not going to do that anymore, I don't think. We're going to do it online. And it's fine. But the reason we did get up at 5:30 in the morning is that we somehow knew that it does make a difference whether you're physically present. It does make a difference. It makes a difference to an entire communicational situation. But the paradox is also there. I mean, as Chiara says, that, you know, I don't know about Italy, but here, when politicians could no longer, because of the very restrictive sort of rules of movement in the spring, they couldn't leave their house. So we could see what it looked like, you know, in the kitchen of our finance minister, for example. So you got this sort of very intimate relationship to politicians. They were no longer dressed up in the TV studio. They were at home, looking like almost like ordinary people. So you've got that. And body language, yeah, but I don't know. You know, Malinowski spoke about phatic communication which is just about itself, which is not meant to convey information. It's the kind of stuff that, well, how are you, and nice weather today, and, you know, that sort of thing, which doesn't really mean anything. And a lot of what we do is phatic. I mean, and it's much of it is non-verbal. So I would defend that. But by all means, sometimes you can become more intimate online. And this is also some of the research we have on Facebook from other parts of the world shows that in Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, young people on Facebook say that it's easier for them to be personal on Facebook than face-to-face, because then you have that filter between yourself and the other person, because they have a culture which is less direct, where showing your emotions is more difficult than in Western Europe. So there's a lot of diversity here. And again, studying the digital can also teach us a lot about the physical world. I mean, I think that's important. Now, when it comes to Sara Bonfanti's question about personal identities, yes, I think this is a real danger, and it's odd, isn't it? That in fact, in some ways, Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, turned out to be a more precise prediction than George Orwell, 1984. Although in China, they seem to have both. Because we give away so much information. We leave so many electronic traces every day, each and every one of us, and it's collected. So that if I, for example, I do a web search for a Christmas present for my daughter, I'm looking for a particular kind of book for my daughter. And then suddenly in my Facebook feed, I get lots of adverts for books 5 minutes later. And it doesn't feel good. I mean, you know that they're only trying to sell you things, but you also know that this information can also be used for other things. So the social dilemma film has been criticized for being a bit one-sided, you know, etc. But quite clearly, the problems that it's pointing to are very real. And another very real problem is to do with the way in which, as I said, the algorithms are actually written. The people who write the algorithms, they're almost like God, you know, writing the script of the world. So yes, we should keep that in mind. I know, Bruno, we have to end, but just a final question: research about cross-cultural approaches? Yes, there is in fact quite a bit, and we have. I mean, in the space of just 10 years, there's quite a lot of research on smartphone use in Bolivia, in Peru, you know, in Malaysia, among poor people in the Indian countryside, and it's fascinating stuff, and you'll find some of it online. Or you can send me an email and I can give you some.
We can enjoy some more minutes after 7, and we, because Greca Melloni asks to ask directly the question, please, short and sharp.
Yeah, thank you, Bruno. Yes, thank you for this interesting presentation. I will try to be super fast. At the beginning of the pandemic, I was in Austria, and it was very ironic a situation that when the border closed, it was the time when they supposed in Austria to harvest the asparagus. And this harvesting of asparagus relies on the migrants from neighboring countries. And the government didn't know, was struggling to know how to fix this problem, because it was the time and they could not wait for the pandemic to stop. And this happened in other places, also in Italy. Mm-hmm. So there is a biological time that we need to kind of wait. As you said, trees, we have to wait trees to grow in a certain way with a certain time. And other things, especially related with food and also animals. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if, in your opinion, we can afford as a species or as humans to accelerate in this range, or is there a way to merge these conflicting temporalities? Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, that's a complex question. It is very interesting, but perhaps we could say that in the light of the pandemic, that anything that is digital is more or less unaffected. Maybe that is really the main sort of lesson from the pandemic. Because had these migrant workers been able to harvest asparagus via, you know, social media or online, it wouldn't have been a problem. But since they have to move their bodies, suddenly they become a problem, because they may be the carriers of disease. So I think that's a good illustration of the way in which these temporalities conflict. But also perhaps this is one of the books that should be written about the pandemic, about how it told us something fundamental about the contrast between the physical and the digital world, and that the digital world was more or less unaffected. In fact, it got a great boost. You know, as Naomi Klein, the Canadian cultural critic, warned a few weeks ago, she said that, you know, the politicians were promising us a Green New Deal, okay, with green economy and so on. But instead, what we're getting seems to be a screen New Deal, where we're all, you know, slaves chained to our computers in order to produce surplus value for greedy corporations. So yes, but the problem about migrant labor, it also shows how interconnected we are. That it's like Trotsky said about communism, socialism in one country is impossible. Solving or getting rid of the pandemic in one country is also impossible, because we need to travel and we need to be in contact with each other. And even in this country, far, far to the north, with a very underdeveloped agricultural sector for climatic reasons, even here we rely on migrant labor during the harvesting season. And the farmers have been in serious trouble because they couldn't get people, the people they wanted from Romania and Poland and so on.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Actually, I think it would be nice to read, to close our session, Laura Maritano message, because it gives hope. Syrian children, refugees in the camps during COVID-19 enthusiastically took part in remote learning activities through mobile phones. And it seems that children with learning problems and so on are doing better online than face-to-face. This was my experience. Obviously, we juggled in the ambivalent experience, but it's interesting to see also the unexpected and non-counterintuitive experience that the context we're living in allow us to experience. So thank you very much. Really appreciated your gift, Thomas, and thank you to all of you. You've asked very stimulating questions, and I still want to thank our president, Mara Bernarduzzi, and the three organizers of this conference, Giuffre, Marabello, and Turci, which have done an amazing job. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you and bye-bye. Cheers.
Actually, appuntamento domani per il premio sia alle 9. Mi raccomando, è molto importante che essere in connessione alle 9. Avrei dovuto dirvelo prima, ma sapete che io sono un po' cialtronesco. Arrivederci.
Arrivederci.
Arrivederci.